Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The right of nations to self-determination. 4. Practicality in the national question. Rosa Luxemburg's argument that Section 9 of our program contains nothing practical has been seized upon by the opportunists. Rosa Luxemburg is so delighted with this argument that in some parts of her article this slogan is repeated 8 times on a single page. She writes, Section 9 gives no practical lead on the day-by-day policy of the proletariat, no practical solution of national problems. Let us examine this argument, which elsewhere is formulated in such a way that it makes Section 9 look quite meaningless, or else commits us to support all national aspirations. What does the demand for practicality in the national question mean? It means one of 3 things: support for all national aspirations, the answer yes or no to the question of secession by any nation, or that national demands are in general immediately practicable. Let us examine all 3 possible meanings of the demand for practicality. The bourgeoisie, which naturally assumes the leadership at the start of every national movement, says that support for all national aspirations is practical. However, the proletariat's policy in the national question, as in all others, supports the bourgeoisie only in a certain direction, but it never coincides with the bourgeoisie's policy. The working class supports the bourgeoisie only in order to secure national peace, which the bourgeoisie cannot bring about completely and which can be achieved only with complete democracy, in order to secure equal rights and to create the best conditions for the class struggle. Therefore, it is in opposition to the practicality of the bourgeoisie that the proletarians advance their principles in the national question. They always give the bourgeoisie only conditional support. What every bourgeoisie is out for in the national question is either privileges for its own nation, or exceptional advantages for it. This is called being practical. The proletariat is opposed to all privileges, to all exclusiveness. To demand that it should be practical means following the lead of the bourgeoisie, falling into opportunism. The demand for a yes or no reply to the question of secession in the case of every nation may seem a very practical one. In reality it is absurd, it is metaphysical in theory, while in practice it leads to subordinating the proletariat to the bourgeoisie's policy. The bourgeoisie always places its national demands in the forefront, and does so in categorical fashion. With the proletariat, however, these demands are subordinated to the interests of the class struggle. Theoretically, you cannot say in advance whether the bourgeois democratic revolution will end in a given nation seceding from another nation, or in its equality with the latter. In either case, the important thing for the proletariat is to ensure the development of its class. For the bourgeoisie it is important to hamper this development by pushing the aims of its own nation before those of the proletariat. That is why the proletariat confines itself, so to speak, to the negative demand for recognition of the right to self-determination, without giving guarantees to any nation, and without undertaking to give anything at the expense of another nation. This may not be practical, but it is in effect the best guarantee for the achievement of the most democratic of all possible solutions. The proletariat needs only such guarantees, whereas the bourgeoisie of every nation requires guarantees for its own interest, regardless of the position of, or the possible disadvantages to, other nations. The bourgeoisie is most of all interested in the feasibility of a given demand, hence the invariable policy of coming to terms with the bourgeoisie of other nations, to the detriment of the proletariat. For the proletariat, however, the important thing is to strengthen its class against the bourgeoisie and to educate the masses in the spirit of consistent democracy and socialism. This may not be practical as far as the opportunists are concerned, but it is the only real guarantee, the guarantee of the greater national equality and peace, despite the feudal landlords and the nationalist bourgeoisie. The whole task of the proletarians in the national question is unpractical from the standpoint of the nationalist bourgeoisie of every nation, because the proletarians, opposed as they are to nationalism of every kind, demand abstract equality. They demand, as a matter of principle, that there should be no privileges, however slight. Failing to grasp this, Rosa Luxemburg, by her misguided eulogy of practicality, has opened the door wide for the opportunists, and especially for opportunist concessions to Great Russian nationalism. Why Great Russian? Because the Great Russians in Russia are an oppressor nation, and opportunism in the national question will of course find expression among oppressed nations otherwise than among oppressor nations. On the plea that its demands are practical, the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations will call upon the proletariat to support its aspirations unconditionally. The most practical procedure is to say a plain yes in favor of the secession of a particular nation rather than in favor of all nations having the right to secede. The proletariat is opposed to such practicality. While recognizing equality and equal rights to a national state, it values above all and places foremost the alliance of the proletarians of all nations, and assesses any national demand, any national separation, from the angle of the workers' class struggle. This call for practicality is in fact merely a call for uncritical acceptance of bourgeois aspirations. By supporting the right to secession, we are told, you are supporting the bourgeois nationalism of the oppressed nations. This is what Rosa Luxemburg says, and she is echoed by Semkovsky, the opportunist, who incidentally is the only representative of liquidationist ideas on this question, in the liquidationist newspaper. Our reply to this is, no, it is to the bourgeoisie that a practical solution of this question is important. To the workers the important thing is to distinguish the principles of the two trends. Insofar as the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation fights the oppressor, we are always, in every case, and more strongly than anyone else, in favor, for we are the staunchest and the most consistent enemies of oppression. But insofar as the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation stands for its own bourgeois nationalism, we stand against. We fight against the privileges and violence of the oppressor nation, and do not in any way condone strivings for privileges on the part of the oppressed nation. If, in our political agitation, we fail to advance and advocate the slogan of the right to secession, we shall play into the hands, not only of the bourgeoisie, but also of the feudal landlords and the absolutism of the oppressor nation. Kautsky long ago used this argument against Rosa Luxemburg, and the argument is indisputable. When, in her anxiety not to assist the nationalist bourgeoisie or Poland, Rosa Luxemburg rejects the right to secession in the program of the Marxists in Russia, she is in fact assisting the Great Russian Black Hundreds. She is in fact assisting opportunist tolerance of the privileges, and worse than privileges, of the Great Russians. Carried away by the struggle against nationalism in Poland, Rosa Luxemburg has forgotten the nationalism of the Great Russians, although it is this nationalism that is the most formidable at the present time. It is a nationalism that is more feudal than bourgeois, and is the principal obstacle to democracy and to the proletarian struggle. The bourgeois nationalism of any oppressed nation has a general democratic content that is directed against oppression, and it is this content that we unconditionally support. At the same time, we strictly distinguish it from the tendency towards national exclusiveness. We fight against the tendency of the Polish bourgeois to oppress the Jews, etc., etc. This is unpractical from the standpoint of the bourgeois and the Philistine, but it is the only policy in the national question that is practical, based on principles, and really promotes democracy, liberty and proletarian unity. The recognition of the right to secession for all. The appraisal of each concrete question of secession from the point of view of removing all inequality, all privileges, and all exclusiveness. Let us consider the position of an oppressor nation. Can a nation be free if it oppresses other nations? It cannot. The interests of the freedom of the Great Russian population, see footnote 1, require a struggle against such oppression. The long, centuries-old history of the suppression of the movements of the oppressed nations, and the systematic propaganda in favor of such suppression coming from the upper classes have created enormous obstacles to the cause of freedom of the Great Russian people itself, in the form of prejudices, etc. The Great Russian Black Hundreds deliberately foster these prejudices and encourage them. The Great Russian bourgeoisie tolerates or condones them. The great Russian proletariat cannot achieve its own aims or clear the road to its freedom without systematically countering these prejudices. In Russia, the creation of an independent national state remains, for the time being, the privilege of the great Russian nation alone. We, the great Russian proletarians, who defend no privileges whatever, do not defend this privilege either. We are fighting on the ground of a definite state. We unite the workers of all nations living in this state. We cannot vouch for any particular path of national development, for we are marching to our class goal along all possible paths. However, we cannot move towards that goal unless we combat all nationalism, and uphold the equality of the various nations. Whether the Ukraine, for example, is destined to form an independent state is a matter that will be determined by 1,000 unpredictable factors. Without attempting idle guesses, we firmly uphold something that is beyond doubt: the right of the Ukraine to form such a state. We respect this right. We do not uphold the privileges of great Russians with regard to Ukrainians. We educate the masses in the spirit of recognition of that right, in the spirit of rejecting state privileges for any nation. In the leaps which all nations have made in the period of bourgeois revolutions, clashes and struggles over the right to a national state are possible and probable. We proletarians declare in advance that we are opposed to great Russian privileges, and this is what guides our entire propaganda and agitation. In her quest for practicality, Rosa Luxemburg has lost sight of the principal practical task both of the great Russian proletariat and of the proletariat of other nationalities, that of day-by-day agitation and propaganda against all state and national privileges, and for the right, the equal right of all nations, to their national state. This, at present, is cut principal task in the national question, for only in this way can we defend the interests of democracy and the alliance of all proletarians of all nations on an equal footing. This propaganda may be unpractical from the point of view of the great Russian oppressors, as well as from the point of view of the bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations. Both demand a definite yes or no, and accuse the Social Democrats of being vague. In reality it is this propaganda, and this propaganda alone, that ensures the genuinely democratic, the genuinely socialist education of the masses. This is the only propaganda to ensure the greatest chances of national peace in Russia, should she remain a multinational state, and the most peaceful, and for the proletarian class struggle, harmless, division into separate national states, should the question of such a division arise. To explain this policy, the only proletarian policy, in the national question more concretely, we shall examine the attitude of great Russian liberalism towards the self-determination of nations, and the example of Norway's secession from Sweden. Notes. 1. A certain LVL. See footnote 2, in Paris considers this word un-Marxist. This LVL is amusingly superclug, too clever by half. And this too clever by half LVL apparently intends to write an essay on the deletion of the words population, nation, etc., from our minimum program, having in mind the class struggle. Lenin's note. 2. LVL. L. Vladimirov, pseudonym of M. K. Shayin-Finkel, a social democrat.